Okay, now I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the fact that the whole Cassatt family, essentially, well, maybe not the whole family, but the parents now moved to Paris. By this time, father has lost much of the family fortune, most of the money, and so they are living with very modest means, very respectable. They're not starving or poverty-stricken. They have servants and things like that. One of the websites that I looked at said something about them living in a very respectable part of town, but it wasn't the fashionable part of town. And Mr. Cassatt had always decided that when he retired, he would move to Paris. And now that seemed a really good idea after all their daughters were there. And his heart condition, was getting worse, so that, he needed to retire. And at that time, Europe was so much cheaper than the United States. So, it was a good idea all around, I guess. Of course, when the family moves over there and takes an apartment, Mary is supposed to come and live with her family. So Mary and Lydia both, would be living with them. And the father insists that if Mary's going to have a studio, then, her art has to pay for them. He's not going to fund this out of, say, his legacy, which is essentially he's living on an inheritance, pretty much. Well, fortunately for Mary, her art was starting to sell. And it sold, as it picked up, it sold for quite respectable amounts of money, like $100 a painting, which doesn't sound like too much today, but back then was quite a bit. I think their monthly rent was something like $65. So the financial success, as well as things like being accepted into the salon, was what really seemed to convince the family that Mary was actually doing something real and important. And in fact, at one point, I think she is actually helping out the family finances. I should also say that they did have another source of help. Her brother, Alex, did very well for himself. Alex was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he had married the niece of President Buchanan. So he was in the highest social circles, and he was making lots of money and being a very successful businessman. So he would also sometimes send money to the family. Now, one of the things that male artists usually do not have to do, that Mary Cassatt had to, was she had all of the family duties that a 19th century woman was supposed to do if she was unmarried. The assumption is if you're unmarried, you don't have a husband, you don't have children to take care of, then you should be the one to be taking care of the family. And this is particularly nursing duties. And Lydia, very sadly, had a kidney disease, Bright's disease, they call it. For a long time, they just thought, they just didn't believe it. But eventually, it did kill her. And the father had a heart condition, and he died of the heart condition. So for, I think one place said 18 years, Mary had the primary care duties for nursing her sick relatives and taking care of them. In fact, one of the times right before Lydia dies, where it's very, very, there's just so much that she's trying to do to help her sister. Her father writes a letter to someone. He says, well, this summer has been completely lost as far as art, for Mary. She hasn't done any artwork. So this is something that the interruptions for family duties, you'll find, I think there's something like over 300 paintings by Mary Cassatt, but there are periods where there's much fewer paintings, or none at all. because she had to care for her family. And I'm sure she was willing to, but it must have been frustrating at the same time. She went in, and after Lydia died, it was just very, very hard for her to work. She was extremely, we'd say extremely depressed. She was very upset, which of course is something that could happen to anyone, male or female, that someone that you love dies. Can be a problem. I wanted to look at some of these pictures of her family. And you notice the one picture that I have here, I wasn't able to find a date on this, but I used it because she was lying down. But if you noticed in her hand that's furthest from us in the picture, be her right hand, she's holding a book. So it looks like Lydia has just set down the book she's been reading, and now she's looking at us. This is a picture that's known as Les Figaro, or Reading Les Figaro, or the artist's mother reading. Figaro is a newspaper. And there's been a number of things said about this painting. One thing historically is that it was one of the works that she exhibited at the 1879 Impressionist exhibit, the first time she exhibited with the Impressionists. And so we could look at the style here, the colors. Think back to the earlier works we looked at. So they're light. The brushwork is getting freer. There's probably a number of colors in the whites and cream colors there. And the pose is a very informal, intimate pose, like we're right close up. She's not really looking at us. She's very much involved with reading the newspaper. And so this is a scene from modern life, the idea of using, contemporary subjects rather than, something mythological or historical as a subject for fine art. But it may be more than that. One of the things she's doing is reading the newspaper. And as she does this, she's essentially, her mother is being identified as a modern woman. There was a lot of talk about what the new woman would be like. And these were educated women, and women who were perhaps more independent than women were supposed to be. And this marks her as an educated woman. She can read, and she can obviously read very fluently, and she's interested in what's going on in the world. When Linda Nochlin writes about this, she calls this painting a homage to the maternal mind, rather than all these pictures that we see of the artist's mother where they're showing her body, essentially. And here, the idea is that she's a woman of some intellectual gifts. Evidently she was. Of course, she poured them into her family. Now, one of the interesting things is that paintings of women reading, and especially women reading the newspaper, could be viewed as subversive. Now, what do I mean by subversive? As undermining the established order. Because the idea was that the world was divided into two sections. The public world for the males, and this included, of course, politics and what goes on beyond the front door. And, of course, the private domestic sphere for the woman. And so if a woman is reading a newspaper, she's going to be reading things like politics. She's going to be reading things like what's going on in the world outside her domestic sphere. So she is infringing on the male domain. Not everybody probably would catch it when they see that, but some people might be upset when they saw that painting. Here is a woman who's actually reading the newspaper. Some husbands, some fathers in the 19th century would simply decree that the women of their household, their wives and their daughters, were not allowed to read newspapers. And we sometimes hear about them sneaking the paper, essentially. Now, right at this time, there was kind of a public debate going on a discourse, as we sometimes say, about women's education in France and how should women be educated and should they be educated. And a few years later, 1880, was the first law to provide French women with a secondary education, something beyond elementary school. However, it wasn't the same curriculum as the male curriculum, and the curriculum is prescribed by law. So the female curriculum would not lead to college. It wouldn't be college prep, we'd say today. It wouldn't lead them into a profession. They couldn't be lawyers or whatever. But one of the reasons they were willing to allow women more education was the claim was made actually on both sides, both the liberal and the conservative side, that education would be good for the country because it would make women better wives and mothers. I suppose the danger is they might start thinking for themselves, but maybe either they were willing to take the risk, or in most cases they probably wouldn't have thought that the woman could think for herself. Oh, I'm being tongue-in-cheek there. And you'll see throughout, I think you saw with Berthe Morisot, there were a lot of people reading books, a lot of women and young girls reading books in some of her paintings. And there's a number of paintings by Mary Cassatt where they're reading books, or in this case, there seem to be several where the young ladies are reading the newspaper. And so one of these is called On the Balcony, another on the balcony, but the Impressionist one. And the other one is Lydia reading the newspaper. So they're both dating from about the same time as the Le Figaro, or the portrait of the artist's mother reading the newspaper, and they're both having their mind go out into that public sphere and find out what's going on around them. You might notice that the colors are light. Light seems to shine on these forms, and they're very, very freely painted. So the style is what we call Impressionist. And one of the things people do try to figure out with Mary Cassatt is she doing something that, today, with our wonderful hindsight, we would read as feminist? I call that subversive. Or is it just, she's just showing what's going around the house? I mean, maybe there isn't any little message there. If and when there is, it's subtle. I was going to say, a lot of people would just see this as an attractive picture. And it would be the kind of people who say, oh, women shouldn't read newspapers, and she's showing them reading newspapers. They would get very upset. Same year, 1878, she was quite productive that year. She painted this really interesting, I guess it's a kind of portrait, but it's a picture of a little girl in a blue armchair. It's now in the National Gallery of Washington. That's what the NGW is. I should say that I sometimes just use abbreviations for the galleries, and it helps me remember it. I don't have to write them all out. NGL is National Gallery London. I don't think we have anything on Mary Cassatt there, at least not in this presentation. NGW is National Gallery Washington, National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Now, one of the things was interesting. I read about Mary Cassatt, and we'll talk about her influence of Japanese art, and they talk about her going to an exhibit in 1890 and seeing this Japanese art. But she must have seen Japanese art before it was around. And so when we look at this work, we do see some things that have been considered to be influenced from Degas and from Japanese art. That high point of view where you're looking down. The patterns, all the patterns in all of these settees and chairs, big overstuffed chairs around, and they have upholstery on them with patterns, which are very freely painted. And the slight asymmetry keeps it more lively. The young lady is not in the exact center. She's off to one side, and then she's balanced out by her little dog. And of course here we can see this, something that Mary Cassatt does is she doesn't sentimentalize children. The little girl is dressed up as they would be in the 19th century in, very beautiful clothing, and she's just sprawled there. And little kids, you can imagine somebody saying, now sit up. posture. And this is a little girl. She's not going to do that. She's just sprawled out there in the armchair. So very natural, very honest, very real in a sense. Also freely painted with all the wonderful loose brush work, and bright colors, the bright blue contrasted with the whites. And as we said before, with Mary Cassatt and Degas, the light that streams in and that illuminates their pictures doesn't dissolve the solidity. The objects, such as the girl, and particularly those poofy armchairs, they still look like they're solid. They still look like they have shape, but they can also be read as flat pattern. So you're sort of getting both. This painting is called either The Tea or 5 O'Clock Tea. It's in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's not dated, but they think it's around 1879. And there's a lot of things that people have said about this. One of the questions is, how do we interpret it? So let's look at it. We see that interest in pattern and how she's able to use patterns in the wall with the patterns in the cushion, even patterns in the picture over the fireplace, and freely painted different textures, such as the difference between the china cups and the silver teapots and tray, which gleam. And what we have is the lady of the house, and it's probably Lydia, sort of leaning back against the cushions, sort of a thoughtful pose. Her hand is up to her chin. And her guest, and we know she's the guest because she still has her gloves on, is drinking her tea. And the teacup is covering up her face. So it's this feeling of a sort of a slice of life, that moment in time, which of course the Impressionists are very interested in catching the moment. And it's not the kind of thing you might expect where the woman's face would be showing. I've been trying to figure out just what Lydia's mood is. And I'll let you decide for yourself. Is she happy to have that guest there? Is she just like, why doesn't she go away? And of course, that kind of thing, trying to read the mood, has something to do with the interpretation of the painting. And there have been a number of modern interpretations suggesting quite differing ways that we could read or interpret this painting. One is that it is simply a statement showing the traditional values. The woman's place is in the home. And of course, she has social duties. And this is, a contemporary woman and what she is supposed to be doing if she's from the upper middle class. Another idea, perhaps you might say a more feminist idea, is the idea that it shows how women are confined in the home, and that there's a very subtle negative going on here, that the interpretation is critical, that women shouldn't be so confined. And I think that would have a lot to do with Lydia's mood, if she feels like she's sort of being imprisoned within the house, if that's one of the things that might be going on there. And another idea has seen it as a way of empowering women because when they come for tea and they talk, they can do social networking, which is actually true. If they have good works to do or something like this, they can find support. I'm not quite sure that's what's going on there. We have somebody who isn't really carrying on conversation and someone else who's busy drinking the tea. One of the things we also have to keep in mind, and this has come up with other paintings, of course, is that our interpretation of a painting today, with all the history and the women's movement and all sorts of different things that have happened, our point of view may be very, very different than what the 19th century point of view is. So we may be reading a little much into some of these paintings. But then Mary Cassatt was an unusual woman. She's a woman who steps a little bit over the boundary. She always does what's respectable, except she has a career and she doesn't get married, and she makes those choices. So she she might be more aware of the restrictions than a woman who's completely accepted them and takes them as normal. People will just write articles and argue about it, I guess. This is, as you can see, a really colorful picture. The woman in a loggia, or a loge. It used to always be called Lydia in the loge, and then they decided that Lydia's hair was darker, so it couldn't be Lydia. So now it's just a woman. And it's in one of those theater pictures. Mary Cassatt's subjects are upper middle class female activities. It's where she could go. She's not going to go out to the cafes in Montmartre. She's not that kind of woman. But she can go to the theater, she can go to the opera. So here's a woman seated presumably in the box at the opera, or the loge at the opera. And the back wall is covered with this curving glass. So what you're seeing behind her is a reflection not only of her back, but of the people who are in the other boxes on the other side of the theater. Now, the Impressionists, of course, were very interested in the effect of light. If you can't go out and, paint in the city or paint in the country from landscapes, because that's not something the woman would probably do, but you can be interested in other kind of light that comes through the window. And in this case, gaslight. Essentially, you've got an artificial light here. And what she does, of course, is show multiple colors within this light. So we see the reflections, and that idea of the mirror and reflections is a theme that we'll see again in Cassatt. The reflections of the curved mirror behind the woman, very, very freely painted. The reflection is even freer than the figure. We see beautiful pastels, pinks, blues, greens, yellows, just filled with, the colors seem to be filled with light. And here when I'm saying pastel, I'm talking about, there's two meanings for pastel. One is the tool, the sort of greasy crayon, which of course Rosalba Carrera used. And the other, which I'm talking about here, is the color. When a color is called pastel, it means that there's been white mixed in with it. So it's a very light color, like a light blue or a pink, as opposed to a red. The other thing you might notice is her pose. Once again, we have something where we're looking down on the figure, and she's leaning over in a diagonal. Now, diagonals always suggest movement. So even though she's seated there and she's a little twist to her body, there is this suggestion of action. Livens up the picture even more. This is another painting at the opera. The mood's fairly different, and it's a much discussed picture, and we'll see why in a minute. Woman in black at the opera. Now, this woman's wearing much plainer clothes, but she's probably an older woman than the very young woman we saw a minute ago. Maybe she's a widow, maybe she's just more conservative with her dress. And she is being quite conservative with her dress, as a matter of fact. And you'll see that she has her opera glasses and is looking at the stage very intently. The curved mirror is reflecting the other boxes. And you see a man in one of the boxes taking his glass and aiming it at her or at someone near her. We'll talk about that in a minute. Rather than looking at the stage. Well, people did go to the theater to see and be seen. But the idea is that the woman is usually the spectacle. She's usually what is looked at. The men all can look at the woman. The woman is not supposed to be looking around at the men very wantonly. So the woman is the object of the gaze, as they often say. Well, here it's turned it around a little bit because she is certainly the gazer, the spectator of the play, but she doesn't even realize that this man is looking at her, or is he? For a long time, that's what we said is going on. But if you look very carefully over her shoulder, there's a figure that is probably a woman with a very, very low cut garment. Sort of décolletage that contrasts to the garment that our more modest woman in black is wearing. And it's now suggested that perhaps the man isn't looking at the woman in black, but he's looking at this daringly dressed young lady nearby. But we still have that idea of spectacle, spectator, and here the woman is both, in a sense. If she's being looked at, she's the spectacle, she's the gazee, she's the person that they're looking at, gazing at. And you can see here with the details what's going on with that man. Mary Cassatt paints a number of these pictures at the theater or the opera because it was one of the places that they would go and socialize. And this is known as the Loggia. And you see the two young ladies. One of them may be Mary Ellison, who was a friend. And they're in their box. In this case, they're not leaning diagonally. Some of the action, if you will, is from the curve of the fan. And there's a little bit of diagonal with her holding the flowers and following up her arm, the woman in the foreground. One of the things about this picture, though, is there are just so many, many colors in it. It's extremely freely painted. And you'd be hard-pressed probably to say what color is the woman in the foreground's gown. Is it pink? It's got some yellow in it. It's got some blue in it. It's got some violet in it. And of course, the picture is just showing a few of these. If you actually see the painting, there's a lot more of the different colors. See the richness of her brushstroke.